Sir Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you, my friends. When I was a mere boy, I discovered on the flyleaf of one of my textbooks a little poem, which I've never forgotten. It read, "Do you see the way that the fisherman doth take to catch a fish? Behold, what engines doth he make, how he applies his snares and lines and angles and nets to catch a fish. But there are fish which neither hook nor line nor snare nor net will ever make thine. They must be grasped for and tickled too, or they'll ne'er be catched, whate'er you do." You know, I decided as a boy I wanted to do that, not become a fisherman, but to fish for something a little higher, perhaps, to grasp and grope, to catch and capture the hearts, the minds, and perhaps even influence the deeds of my fellow men. And I pursued oratory myself. I remember practicing and rehearsing and memorizing and growing quite sick of it all, but doing it anyway. But you know, I developed those skills, as you all have done, and I became very proficient. And I discovered that adding a little satire and perhaps some mimicry would give even more force to my words, and I succeeded. I succeeded in embarrassing a young couple once, shortly after their marriage. I succeeded politically in embarrassing my opponents on a number of occasions. Once, to my shame, I brought one of my opponents to public weeping for the humiliation I created, and I discovered that while I had developed a force in words, I was lacking in moral force. I have aspired to greatness. But as much as I aspired to greatness, it became a lifelong ambition to also match that aspiration with a desire to be worthy of the esteem of my fellow men. And if I can say anything to you this day, it would be, some of you will win and some of you will not. I have learned more from my failures than from all of my successes. May I tell you a little story? Once in court in Illinois, an old woman was brought to the stand. The prosecuting lawyer said, "Mrs. Jones, do you know me?" She says, "Williams, I've known you since you were a boy, and you know that. And quite frankly, I'm quite disappointed with you. You lie, you cheat on your wife, you manipulate people, you talk about them behind your back. You think you're a big shot, but you'd haven't the brains to realize you'll never amount to anything more than a 2-bit paper pusher." He was astounded. He didn't know what to say. He said, "Well, do you know the prosecuting lawyer?" She said, "You know I know him as well as I know you. He's lazy, bigoted, he's got a drinking problem, can't build a normal relationship with anyone. His law practice is the worst in the state. He's cheated on his wife 3 times. Yes, I know him." Well, once the courtroom settled down, the judge asked both counselors to come up and approach the bench, and he said, "If either of you ask that woman if she knows me, you'll be jailed for contempt of court." My friends, it became clear to me that everything about me would eventually become known because of the times into which I was pushed. May I recommend to you to not only develop the skills of the tongue, but a moral force to your life, so that when it's all said and done, what you have said will be backed up by who you are. It's been said of history hitherto that might makes right, but I believe it's for us and for our time to reverse that maxim and to say that right makes might. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and after that fishing story, we have two competitors who are dying to go fishing for a national championship. We started with 219 competitors, and I would like to take just a couple moments before I introduce these two to thank the committee who worked on Lincoln-Douglas debate. Glenda Ferguson from Texas, Candy King, Texas, Georgia Brady, Missouri, Lynn Coyne, Massachusetts, Lynn Goodnight, USC, California, Cherian Koshi, Minnesota, and Greg Malice, Illinois. I'm Pauline Carochi from Colorado, and I chaired LD Tab, and it gives me great pleasure at this time to introduce to you on the affirmative 212. 212. And on the negative, code 314. Code 314. Good luck to the debaters, and let us begin.
So I think these people are worthy of a second thank you. So again, thank you to the NFL Executive Committee, Scott One and the National Forensics League, the National Tournament Committee, the LD Tab Room staff and judges. They've done a great job all week. Thanks to the City of Philadelphia and the Lincoln Financial Group and all the other sponsors of the tournament. I'd also like to thank my coach, Wesley Craven. His dedication to this activity and to teaching are truly inspiring. I can't thank him enough for all the hours he spent working with me on debate, hours he probably should have spent working on his thesis. I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am today if it weren't for him, and I couldn't ask for a better coach, both for his teaching and for his friendship. He's made this activity educational, but most importantly, a whole lot of fun. I'd also like to thank my teammates, especially Sam Reese-Dennis. His help and support have helped me through many long tournament weekends, and his experience at this tournament in particular has helped me have success. I couldn't ask for a better teammate or a better friend. He's made this activity a lot of fun as well. And I'd also like to thank my family and friends. The support of my parents and brothers and extended family has been unending. Unfortunately, often manifest by their slightly embarrassing but always appreciated online debate message board posts. But you guys know how much I love you, and thank you for everything you've done. And so also I'd like to thank my opponent, Tara. Congratulations on everything that she's done. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank our judges. And I think we're ready to begin. Scientists have an ethical obligation to be socially responsible. Thus, I affirm the resolution: the pursuit of scientific knowledge ought to be constrained by concern for societal good. I offer the following definitions to provide a fair debate. The pursuit of scientific knowledge is an activity of striving to gain knowledge accumulated by systematic study of natural phenomena. Ought is defined as a duty or obligation. Constrain is to inhibit or restrain. Interpretations of societal good may vary from society to society, but they are always manifest by a system of general rules guiding public behavior that accounts for the welfare of all individuals in that society. So what is good in a given society may vary, but there's always some collective conception of right conduct. Thus, an appropriate definition for concern for societal good is ethics, as defined by philosophy professor David Resnick. Quote, ethics is a system of public general rules for guiding human conduct. Because a society is composed of an aggregate of individual relationships, the only way to judge whether a duty exists to society is whether certain individuals, in this case scientists, are bound by public rules to account for the welfare of all individuals in society. Based on these definitions, my interpretation of the resolution is that a scientist has an ethical obligation to restrain themselves from engaging in research that they are concerned will harm society. The agent being constrained and the agent constraining are, in this case, both the scientist. This interpretation is reasonable because scientists are constantly confronted by decisions whose consequences can impact all individuals in society and must decide for themselves whether to continue or to constrain their research. It is educational because, particularly in this, the final round at nationals, many of the observers may plan on becoming scientists, and as I will show, a concern for societal good may necessitate their making decisions based on ethical obligations to refrain from research that may harm society. I value social responsibility. Nobel Prize-winning scientist Joseph Rotblat explains, quote, we live in a world community with ever greater interdependence. An interdependent community offers great benefits to its members, but by the same token it imposes obligations on them. Every citizen has to be accountable for his or her deeds. We all have a responsibility to society. But the need for such responsibility is particularly imperative on scientists, mainly because scientists understand the technical problems better than the average citizen or the politician, and knowledge brings responsibility, end quote. As my interpretation indicated, the criterion that upholds social responsibility is the existence of an ethical obligation. The standard for which side wins the round hinges on whether or not an ethical obligation exists. I define an ethical obligation as a duty of necessity or dependency whose basis is not found in any objective truth, but rather simply in the expectations created by social relationships and associations. Abraham Lincoln justifies this standard when he explained, quote, he who wills freedom for himself must simultaneously will freedom for others, because all men by nature have an equal right to justice. All men have an equal duty to do justice. The possibility of justice exists in every relationship with every other human being, end quote. Because the existence of ethical obligations based on the social consequences of science fulfill our equal duty to do justice, we must uphold social responsibility. Remember, the only impacts that link to the criterion then are those that prove or disprove the existence of an ethical obligation. My only contention states that scientists have an ethical obligation to constrain their pursuit of scientific knowledge by concern for societal good. Ethical rules originate out of associations scientists have with different groups. They can be based off the scientific community, the national society manifest through the laws of that government, and the common bond scientists have as human beings to the rest of humanity. Each of these ethical origins provide independent justifications for the existence of an ethical obligation to constrain pursuit. Subpoint A. Scientists have an ethical obligation to constrain because by pursuing scientific knowledge that may harm society, they endanger the entire scientific community by creating public mistrust that results in underfunding and reckless and irrational regulations. Resnick explains, quote, "The principle of public responsibility is important in maintaining the public's trust and respect. A public that constantly learns of fantastic, though ultimately erroneous and misleading scientific findings will lose its respect and support for science. Public respect and support are important because they result in funding, which leads to the pursuit of knowledge and truth," end quote. The public responsibility that Resnick explicitly identifies creates an ethical obligation on the part of scientists to the scientific community. By exempting scientists from their ethical obligations, the negative harms science and the scientific community and any of the benefits therein. Subpoint B. Scientists are citizens of their respective societies just like all other individuals within those societies. By nature of this designation, they are bound by the same obligation to the law as all other citizens. The nature of societies creates a reciprocal obligation from all citizens. Citizens take things from society and the law, like safety and rights, and in return they are obligated to the law. In the affirmative world, scientists are obligated to constrain their research by external ethical rules, in this case manifest by laws. This may seem intuitive, but the negative clearly violates this principle. By arguing that concerns for societal good shouldn't act as constraints on research, the negative defends scientists being exempt from the law when it comes to their research. This is a clear violation of the criterion, as it would mean failing to uphold one's obligation to the law and harm social responsibility as the negative advocates for scientists being able to transgress the law. Remember, the argument is not that breaking the law is morally wrong, but rather that everyone, including scientists, have an ethical obligation to follow the law. Proving the existence of this obligation is all the affirmative must do to win the round. Subpoint C. An ethical obligation also exists because pursuing scientific knowledge carries enormous risk. Professor William Leese writes, quote, "A new category of moral risk is created by biotechnology and nanotechnology which threatens the ethical basis of human civilization. There are also catastrophic risks in that their negative and evil applications are virtually unlimited, e.g. using bioengineered pathogens as weapons of war or terrorism. Everyone on Earth is at risk of having these powers become instruments in an Armageddon waged to the bitter end," end quote. Biotechnology and nanotechnology are but two examples. The catastrophic potential for scientific knowledge to affect every member of the human race warrants an obligation to constrain. Rotblat furthers, quote, "Advances in science have led to our acquiring the capacity for self-destruction, to the development of the means to destroy the human species itself. Other means of wholesale destruction, perhaps more readily available than nuclear weapons, may result from further scientific research if it is allowed to go on without any restriction," end quote. Rotblat argues that mere research creates the capability for great destruction, which in turn mandates an obligation on scientists as they are the only holders of such power. The potential for their research to directly affect so many people creates an obligation for scientists to constrain and be socially responsible for the sake of humanity. The organization Student Pugwash is a collection of students who plan to become scientists that promote the recognition of the ethical implications of science. They have a pledge that serves as a perfect example of the real-world significance of affirming this resolution. It reads, "I promise to work for a better world, where science and technology are used in socially responsible ways. I will not use my education for any purpose intended to harm human beings or the environment. Throughout my career, I will consider the ethical implications of my work before I take action." This is a perfect example of how the affirmative case works in the real world, by causing scientists to internalize constraints and take responsibility for the consequences of their research. So for these reasons, I ask you to affirm the resolution.
At the top of your case, you define societal good as something that differs from society to society, right?
Well, I define it specifically as ethics.
Okay, but ethics also differ from society to society, right?
Right. It would be irresponsible for me to get up here and say that like one society's ethics is necessarily the same as other societies' ethical codes.
Okay, so then necessarily affirming the resolution means you're affirming a subjective concept then, right?
Subjectivity doesn't deny the existence of an obligation. Even if it's manifest different in different societies, it still exists.
Right, my problem is how can you make a blanket statement about what we ought to do if it's subjectively defined?
Like I just told you, just because the obligation may be manifest in one way in country A or in society A and it's different in
my
society
problem is if societal good is defined vaguely as public, like something that where you keep in the consideration the welfare of society as a whole, don't you think that the conception of what ethics would be radically different in a democratic society versus an authoritarian
society? The point of that
society?
phrase in that analysis is just like, emphasizing the societal part of societal good, and in other words, like it applies to all people within a society.
Right.
I'm not arguing that there's some like objective good that everybody loves.
Right, my problem is though, then how can you warrant the judges signing an affirmative ballot for a resolution that you have to prove normatively true if your own constructive just told us that it's impossible for you to normatively prove the resolution true?
Like, I don't understand why my constructive A just told you that it's impossible to prove it normatively true. 2, I don't see why like that's necessarily a burden of mine. 3, I just tell you that I look at the resolution, I have to prove that this ought to happen. If I prove they're obligated to do it, even if that's manifest different in different societies, that still affirms the resolution.
Your second contention, or your subpoint C, says that there are numerous risks to pursuing scientific knowledge, right?
Right.
Okay, so if the numerous risks come from the scientific community themselves, right? Like the way the scientists are doing things.
Level, I suppose.
Right, okay, so scientists are pursuing things that are harmful, that's why they need regulations, right?
Okay. Well, okay, you're sort of skewing the analysis, right? Like it says that like technology, especially in modern day society, has such enormous risk, and the scientists are the only holders of that power, and that warrants them needing to like recognize that they have an obligation to take into account.
Okay, so what you're saying is that scientists pursue harmful activities which need to be regulated, thus we are going to tell the scientist to self-regulate.
Okay, like when you say we are going to tell the scientists, like I'm talking about recognizing that this obligation exists.
Right, my problem is there seem to be some internal contradictions in your case. At the top of your case, you say that scientists are the ones that limit themselves, but your subpoint B says that scientists have to listen to external constraints like laws.
Here's the difference. Like a government, for example, may have these ethical codes that act as constraints, but at the most basic level, scientists have to internalize those codes. That's all the argument.
So my problem is, are the constraints coming externally, or are the scientists doing it within their own communities?
Like laws may act as constraints on scientists, but only at the point where they internalize those laws.
What's the motivation for scientists to constrict their own?
They don't have to be motivated. It just has to. I just have to prove that there's an obligation.
Okay, so your subpoint A of your first contention says that scientists rely on funding, so they need to take in consideration what the public wants, right?
Okay, it says that because like the scientific community is an interdependent community, they have an obligation to act in a way that doesn't put that community in harm.
Who in society holds the most funding?
I don't exactly know how
Would
to
you
answer
agree that it's like
question.
the elite groups in society or the powerful groups who are the ones that have that funding?
Sure.
Okay. I'll take Ready for a third round of thank yous? All right, before I begin, I'd like to thank Scott One, the NFL Executive Secretary, the NFL Executive Committee, and the NFL for making the tournament happen. I'd like to thank Brother Rita Sterner, his committee in the city of Philadelphia for hosting the tournament, Thank you to the Lincoln Financial Group and all other tournament sponsors for your generous contributions in helping to continue the activity. Finally, thank you to my parents, my friend and incredibly dedicated coach Tim Case, Dr. Mummy, Dean Rhodes, my teammate Kelsey, Dan Wittes and Steve Shapaw of my Inspiration, Flat E, and the Victory Briefs Debate Institute. Also, I would like to thank Jeremy, my opponent, and the judges. Ready? Because negating allows for innovation, I negate that resolve. The pursuit of scientific knowledge ought to be constrained by concern for societal good. Constraint, as per Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is defined as to force or compel. I agree with his definition of scientific knowledge and pursuit. The resolution places a burden on the affirmative, though, to prove normatively true whether stringent restrictions ought to be placed on scientific research or study. Concern, as per American Heritage Dictionary, refers to a troubled or anxious state of mind resulting from interest. Thus, constraints based upon concern for societal good are determined by fear driven by self-interest. The value for the round is innovation because when science becomes regulated and the discovery of potentially beneficial innovations is shut off, research is done covertly, and constraining the pursuit of knowledge defeats its regulatory purpose. Thus, the necessary value criterion is preserving the openness of scientific research. Without science remaining as an overt process, there is no accountability, no mechanism to determine whether society is being served by innovation. Contention 1. Affirming creates arbitrary and unlimited constraints. Creating the precedent of regulating scientific research out of fear justifies infinite restrictions because anything can pose a harm to societal good, which is determined subjectively. Paul Berg, professor at Stanford University School of Medicine, writes, criminalizing pure science is an absurd throwback to prohibitions on speaking out on scientific issues or new truths. I cannot understand anyone who would criminalize a scientific procedure except insofar as it is to be applied. That sets a precedent that says when we conceive of an outcome of a certain line of science that we don't like, we head it off in the past. We prevent the science from being done for fear of what it might disclose or enable us to do. But there's almost no science that couldn't be misleading. Using that logic, anybody could sit down and determine how something could cause great harm and therefore prohibit a perfectly reasonable and valuable line of investigation. Thus, fear-driven restrictions on science prevent innovations because any experiment could be potentially harmful and thus justifiably constrained. This reinforces the power of the elites as they are given unlimited power to prohibit scientific investigation that is seen as not in their best interest, even when that research produces beneficial results. My second contention is that scientific research is inevitable. Constraining its pursuit drives it underground, which is worse because its applications cannot be regulated. Preventing the pursuit of knowledge leads to a loss of legitimacy as governments or interest groups can choose anything to restrict, which leads to mass ignorance in a dark new age. As Daphne Patai, professor at Amherst, argues, when politics attempts to control science, especially when it explicitly seeks to inhibit research, we should all worry. In such circumstances, the pursuit of knowledge is likely to lose legitimacy. And because it is obvious that we can neither predict nor control any given technological innovation, shutting them down in advance can only lead to a dangerous know-nothingism and a dark new age. The choice before us seems to be between research amenable to public scrutiny and discussions or secret research done without public accounting. But that the research will go on one way or another is inevitable. The impacts that the pursuit of scientific knowledge is inevitable, thus we ought not focus on constraining the scientific research, rather focus on how that research is applied once we obtain it. First, placing constraints that drives research underground without regulation only increases the elitist manipulation of scientific knowledge in its pursuit, or we have a second option, which is leaving the pursuit open to public scrutiny, where at least the impacts can be seen and the applications regulated. Daniel Botkin, professor at the University of California, argues that such constraints on the pursuit of knowledge lead to the entrenchment of the interests of powerful groups and elites, which is contrary to freedom and democracy, he writes. The bill appears to create a precedent in which a specific kind of scientific research is made a criminal offense. This is contrary to the ideals of freedom, the pursuit of knowledge, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This precedent is likely to lead to other cases where kinds of scientific research opposed by special interest groups also become the target of legislation that makes them criminal activities. This could be destructive to the pursuit of science. History shows that attempts to legislate ethical activities through prohibition has not worked previously anywhere in Western civilization. On the contrary, government suppression of science has led to the misdirection of science, the wasteful use of resources, and destruction of a society's capacities to advance in science, technology, and creativity. Thus, not only would these regulations fail, but the suppression of science leads to the destruction of a society's capacity for progress. For these reasons, I urge you to negate. At the top of the affirmative case, he gives you the definition of scientific knowledge, but remember, first, just because scientists pursue the knowledge doesn't mean that they will put constraints on themselves. Pragmatically, it is legislation and laws via the government that enforce regulations. But second, his definition is a reason to negate. If societal good is only determined by scientists or the elites, it means that any constraints that scientists put on themselves will only be reinforced by those elite interests. Thus, these constraints either don't pragmatically happen or they entrench oppression. Go to his definition of ought. He says it's a duty, but just remember, because he doesn't define ought as an objective moral obligation, which is the only way to determine what the scientist's obligation would always be, there is no way for him to prove that we can have an obligation towards something that is subjectively defined. So then move to his definition of societal good. This is going to be a very easy place to negate the resolution on face. First, if the societal good can never be objectively determined, you can't affirm because you can't normatively prove a resolution true through subjective measures. Second, making the blanket statement that we ought to always constrain the pursuit of knowledge when it conflicts with a nebulous good justifies infinite restrictions of science, meaning he can never allow for innovation or progress because anything could potentially harm a nebulous, undefined good. But third, because societal good differs, it can be used to justify and enforce inequalities. It is comparatively worse for the affirmative to make constraints and on an obligation that could be used to obligate scientists to do oppressive and harmful actions. Meaning, if you make constraints that are done under a code of ethics defined by some sort of oppressive ideology, affirming mandates that scientists follow that code of ethics, meaning it's always comparatively worse than the minute harm that you might have harmful research done when you negate the resolution. So then go to his analysis about how scientists have an ethical obligation to constrain themselves. First, remember, scientists can have different conflicting obligations, and he gives us no way to determine what obligation is the most important, meaning you can't affirm because he hasn't normatively proven what the obligation is, meaning you don't have a reason to affirm since there is no clear reason what we're obligated to do. Go to his value analysis. His value analysis gives you the same thing. His value premise and its criterion are the exact same thing. There's no difference between them, thus there's no reason on how we can weigh the round. But further, ethics, defined by American Heritage Dictionary, is a system of moral values. Thus, he gave himself the burden to prove a moral obligation exists. The affirmative constructive outlines the opposite, so his own value criterion gives you an independent reason to negate. Then go to his first contention, where he talks about how there's an ethical rule to people within your society. First, his Resnick analysis says that scientists need to be concerned with meeting public needs. Thus, scientists don't have an obligation to the scientific community via his own evidence. This is an internal contradiction. But second, this proves that scientists are manipulated by elites because powerful people in society have funding. He told us that himself. Go to his subpoint B about how they have a reciprocal obligation. Negating doesn't create laws that provide scientists with exemptions from the norm. Remember, when you negate, you still have to follow established laws. It's not like scientists can just murder people and are exempt from all laws altogether. I would say that's historically and status quo untrue. But his subpoint C is another reason to negate. Cross-apply the analysis in my case that tells you because there is always some sort of harm to pursuing scientific knowledge, his own analysis says we would always constrain that, meaning he can never have innovation in the creation of new knowledge because anything could pose a harm to a nebulous good, meaning he can never achieve a value of innovation and he can never achieve societal good.
Right. Mm-hmm. So you think some constraints on science are good, right?
No, I say that we have to keep the process open. The constraints on science come with the application.
So the negative advocacy is no constraints on science.
Right. We constrain the application of science. My analysis in my case tells you the only way to determine whether something is beneficial or harmful to society is in retrospect. Thus, you cannot just make some sort of assertion that it will be harmful unless it's established.
So you're saying that we should constrain the application but not the pursuit of knowledge?
Right.
Okay, that's fine.
I think your own analysis in your subpoint C would say that. Your analysis in your subpoint C says things like nuclear weapons are bad. Right, we stop the application of nuclear weapons, not achieving that type of technology.
What's your criterion?
My criterion is, preserving the openness of scientific research.
Preserving the openness.
Yeah.
Okay, so why does that necessarily lead to innovation?
Right. My analysis tells you that unless you preserve the openness of scientific research, you're going to drive science underground. Okay. The only way to allow for innovation, which your own case would justify, is to negate the resolution because anything could harm like societal goods since it's nebulous.
So like the reason that like preserving openness is good is so like society can have some check on that, like on those sciences, right?
Check the application. Right.
Okay, so then the thesis of the negative advocacy is that the application of science should be constrained and that should be done by the society.
No, I don't give any sort of plan. I'm just saying why you would weigh one against the other. So I'm not saying where the constraints would come from. That's not my burden in the round. I'm just offering you a different way in which we would constrain. We would constrain the application.
Okay, but your entire case is premised on the fact that application is distinct from pursuit, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's go to your responses on the affirmative flow. So you tell me that my value is the same as the criterion, right?
Right.
And that's your only response on the value.
Right. I tell you it's not a weighing mechanism because social responsibility, you say a social responsibility is an ethical obligation. You can't weigh the two if they're just synonymous.
All right, sorry, I'm going to go back to your case. What does the Barker analysis say at the top of your first contention?
The Botkins analysis? Or the Patai analysis is the first thing that I read.
The Botkins.
Okay, Botkin tells you that you cannot tell whether something is going to be good in advance, right?
Okay, so that's just going back to the application versus pursuit, right?
Right.
Okay. Now let's go to the arguments that you put on my definitions. You say that because Like, I define ought as an obligation, and I don't say that it's like an objective moral truth, then I can never affirm the resolution.
Right.
Okay, like, where's the analysis in the NC that I necessarily have to normatively prove the resolution true, and can you read it to me?
Yeah, I can read it to you. It kind of was like the first thing I read. Off of the definitions, I told you. Thus, the resolution places a burden on the affirmative to normatively prove whether stringent restrictions ought to be placed on a scientific research or study.
Okay, like, where's the warrant in that assertion?
Right. A resolution is normative. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be debating, right? Like, if you could just come up here and say, in one society, it would be good to restrict the pursuit of scientific knowledge, there would be no reason for us to debate because the resolution doesn't say one society.
Why
That's
can't
why
I
it's
make a
normative.
statement like killing is normatively wrong, or like harming somebody is normatively wrong, even though somebody might think harming one person is different from another person's conception of what harming another person is?
Right. My problem is, though, under your calculus, you could justify harming somebody because, like, the rest of society could benefit from it.
So before I begin, just to let you know where I'm going, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but we're going to start on the affirmative framework, and then when I'm done with that, I'm going to go to the negative flow and then jump back to the affirmative flow at the end. Starting the affirmative framework, she tries to redefine at the beginning of her case like concern and constraint and stuff like that. The problem is that I define them in my case, and she never gives you a reason why my definitions are inadequate, so you just ignore her new definitions. Her new definitions. Okay, that's fine. Now go to the framework. She says that scientists won't necessarily pursue because they don't want to constrain themselves. It doesn't matter if they want to constrain themselves or not. That doesn't deny the existence of an ethical obligation, and that's all I have to prove. Now you go to my definition of ought. She says I have to prove the statement like normatively true. One, there's no warrant to that. Two, I'd say I do. Just because like an obligation may manifest itself differently in society A than society B doesn't deny that those obligations exist. So I am proving it normatively true. I'm meeting her own burden. Okay, so anyway, she can extend my analysis that tells you that scientists are the agent. She concedes to that. At that point, that's going to take out of a lot of her offense talking about politicizing science. Now you go back, jump to the negative flow. On her value of innovation, one, I'd tell you that it's not inherently good. She never makes that claim in the NC, so it's not like the highest goal in this round. Two, I'd say that it's not mutually exclusive to having constraints. I'd say that innovation isn't just letting science go crazy. Innovation also can include constraints like that. That's necessarily innovating too. Now go to her standard preserving openness. One, I'd say that like preserving openness is like constraints help preserve openness because it necessarily means that there's going to be a check on the scientific pursuits by societal good. In other words, like the openness is going to be necessitated because like the scientists have to be open to society so they can constrain it by societal good. But but the biggest argument is going to come off the first contention. She concedes in CX that her entire case is premised on the fact that there's a distinction between a pure and applied science, but that's not true anymore. Joseph Rotblat argues, quote, "The distinction between pure and applied science is a remnant of the distant past when scientific research was completely divorced from day-to-day life and practical applications that could have resulted from academic research were remote in time and space. Nowadays, the distinction is hardly discernible. Practical applications often follow immediately after scientific discoveries and are pursued by the same people. The amoral attitudes of the advocates of the laissez-faire policy for science is actually highly immoral because it eschews personal responsibility for one's actions," end quote. In other words, in modern society, there is no distinction between pure and applied science. In other words, her whole case is irrelevant because she's talking about, she concedes it's premised on the fact that there's a distinction. At the point where there's no distinction, she's actually affirming the resolution. You can turn her entire case against her because at the point where there's no distinction, the constraining the pursuit of knowledge by societal good is essentially the same as constraining the application of knowledge, which is her entire advocacy. At that point, she's just affirming the resolution for me. If that's not enough, you can go down to her second contention. She talks about research being inevitable, it'll just go underground. If scientists just go underground, they have no source of funding or stuff like that. Like, they need to be in the open to even do their research. Secondly, I tell you that the scientist is the agent, so her arguments about like politicizing science aren't going to matter because she concedes that scientists are the agent. Thirdly, I tell you that the base warrant for this entire advocacy is that she wants to have checks on scientific research. That's the affirmative advocacy. She's just affirming the resolution. Okay, now remember the term that I put because of the distinction between pure and applied science. Now let's go to back to the affirmative flow. You can extend my value. She tells you it's the same as a criterion, but I give you a clear definition with the Rotblat analysis, which tells you that social responsibility is being accountable for your actions. I give you a separate definition of my criterion of ethical obligation as like a duty of necessity arising out of interdependencies. So you extend the value, and she never tells you why it's a bad value, so we're going to look at social responsibility in the round. Then you extend Rotblat, which explicitly tells you that when scientists are part of interdependent communities that depend on them, they have an obligation to give back to that community. So that's all the warrant I need to prove an ethical obligation, and I'm about to do that on case. Now you go to my criterion of ethical obligation, existence of ethical obligation. She completely drops this. You extend it across. She's conceding my analysis. All the resolution asks is that I prove like an obligation true because of my definition of ought as an obligation. She never gives you a clear redefinition. All I have to do is prove the existence of an obligation. She concedes that with the dropping my standard. So now I'll go to my subpoint A. She says like I'm talking about public needs, not the scientific community. That's not. She's mishandling the argument. Extend Resnick, which tells you that the public loses trust in the scientific community if scientists are irresponsible and don't have responsibility. What that means is it creates an interdependency because scientists have an obligation to the scientific community not to be irresponsible so they can maintain funding. Extend that across. That's the first reason you affirm because that proves an obligation. Now go to subpoint C, talking about big risk. She says it's only talking about application, but I've already taken that out with the Rotblat analysis on the top of her case. Furthermore, the Rotblat card in this subpoint specifically talks about research. So you extend Rotblat, who says the research creates such a great capability for harm, and it's all the powers in the hands of the scientists. Therefore, that warrants an obligation back to humanity because they have so much power for destruction. Those are two distinct reasons why I've proven an ethical obligation.
Okay, before I begin, I'm going to start with the framework on the affirmative side of the flow, and then we'll go negative affirmative, and I'll give you voting issues along the way. There was a lot of problems with my opponent's last speech, many of which were dropped analysis. The first comes off the top of the definition of pursuit of scientific knowledge, where I take out that scientists are the actors. The first thing that I told you, this is pragmatically untrue. Just because scientists pursue the knowledge doesn't mean they put the constraints on themselves. Pragmatically, it is legislation and laws via the government that enforces these regulations. I told you that's historically and status quo true. That's the only pragmatic way to have these scientists be regulated. But second, I told you this definition is a reason to negate the resolution. If societal good is only determined by elite communities like scientists or powerful people in society, it means that any constraint that scientists put on themselves will only be reinforced by those elite interests. So either A, the constraints don't pragmatically happen, or B, they entrench oppression. This is a very easy way to negate the resolution. No matter what he defines as ethics or social responsibility, no one has a social responsibility to enforce oppression. So go off his definition of what ought is. He says I don't answer it, but I gave you something very clear and another reason that you cannot affirm the resolution. I told you because he doesn't define ought as an objective moral obligation, which is the only way to determine what the scientist's obligation would always be, there is no way for him to prove that we can have an obligation towards something that is subjectively defined. So he hasn't proven that we even have an obligation unless that obligation is normative. You cannot say we always have an obligation to do X because X could contradict with what the societal good is. That's further justified with the analysis I gave you off of his framework where he says that he only has to show one obligation to society. What I told you is that scientists can have different conflicting obligations. Remember, because these obligations can conflict with each other, he gives us no way to determine what obligation is the most important, meaning you cannot affirm because he hasn't normatively proven what the obligation is, meaning you don't have a reason to vote for him since there is no clear reason what they are obligated to do. If obligations can conflict with each other, that means that they can take each other and cancel themselves out, so the obligation wouldn't exist at all. He doesn't answer that. That takes out all of the affirmative offense because his entire case depends on his framework. But if you don't buy that, a very easy way to negate the resolution comes off the definition of societal good. I gave you 3 reasons why you would reject him on face. The first is that because societal good can never be objectively determined, you can't affirm because you cannot normatively prove a resolution true. He did not get up in his last speech and tell you why he should just be able to prove the resolution true in a couple societies. The problem is the resolution says it's talking about societies as a whole, which is normative. He hasn't proven it normatively true. His own definition says it's subjective. It's subjective. It cannot be normative. You cannot affirm. That's your first negative voting issue. The second negative voting issue is making the blanket statement that we ought to always constrain the pursuit of knowledge when it conflicts with a nebulous good justifies infinite restrictions on science, meaning he can never achieve innovation or progress because he will always restrict the pursuit of scientific knowledge. But if you don't buy that, the next reason to negate is the other response I gave you. Because societal good can differ, one conception of societal good could justify oppressive constraints being put on science, i.e. science would be used to justify things like oppression, meaning he's now saying that you are obligated to fulfill these constraints even if they're oppressive. He can never achieve societal good. He doesn't answer that analysis. At any time, if the societal good is synonymous with oppression, which he doesn't say it's not, you always negate the resolution. He doesn't answer those arguments. They're the easiest way out of the round, but there's about 5 other easy way outs too. He says the obligation doesn't exist even if they differ. The thing is, the obligations, if they differ, mean that you can never normatively prove the resolution true. So now let's look to the criterion debate. There's no reason to use his value analysis. He says, my premise is social responsibility, my criterion is fulfilling social responsibility. That's the same thing. Remember what I told you off of his value criterion, you have to use mine because the only way to determine if you have something if an obligation is being fulfilled, if scientific research is done openly, my criterion's a prerequisite to his, that analysis was read right after I read you my criterion. You extend that, my criterion becomes a prerequisite to his. All I have to prove is that I preserve the openness of research. Go to my first contention. Off of my first contention, the Berg analysis is what you can extend. It says that you could constrain anything out of fear because anything could possibly harm societal good. This is your next voting issue. He can always justify infinite restrictions, meaning he never achieves progress, meaning he never achieves any type of social good. If scientists have a responsibility to the community, I told you they have a responsibility to create beneficial innovations. If they don't do that because they cut off the pursuit of new knowledge, you can never affirm the resolution. The very next easy way out of the round, he reads the Roppler analysis that says there's no distinction between application and research. The problem is his own definition of research says the act of striving towards knowledge, meaning the knowledge is not yet established, so they can't be the same thing. Pursuing research is not the same as having the application. That's why I make the distinction. The next voting issue comes off my second contention, the Patai analysis that says that political and interest groups control science, meaning because we can't predict innovation, cutting it off from the beginning shuts off innovation. He can't achieve the criterion. Then I tell you that he's always going to have covert research. Covert research is always comparatively worse because if something harmful is being created, anticipated. At least when it's open to people, I can create something to stop the application, but he has it done covertly, meaning we never know if scientists fulfill their obligation. You can't affirm the resolution. The next comes off the Bakken analysis, which says that interest groups control it, so you're going to decrease progress, meaning I comparatively outweigh again. Off of his first contention, remember I told you that scientists depend on elites, meaning he entrenches elite opinions, meaning he entrenches oppression through science. The next reason I take out his offense is off the subpoint C. I told you there is always going to be something that could possibly harm a nebulous good. He could justify taking away science altogether because he can be infinitely restrictive. You can never achieve progress if science becomes infinitely restricted. If you have an obligation to society, create beneficial innovations, don't cut them all off altogether.
Okay, so before I begin, I'm just going to touch on the major issues and try to crystallize. I'm going to start on the affirmative framework. I'll jump around and I'll do my best to let you know where I am. Start on her analysis that she said that the scientists aren't the agent, but remember I extended off the bottom of her case in the 1AR that scientists have to be the agents because even if you're talking about laws, they're the ones who internalize those laws. So okay, that's settled. Then she tells you off my definition of ought. She doesn't redefine ought, she just tells you that that means that I have to prove it normatively true. I gave you two responses, one that there's no warrant to that, and two, specifically that I am. Because just because an ethical code in one country is not the same as an ethical code in another country doesn't mean that obligations aren't normatively there. All I have to do is prove that they are, so her argument, like she never responds to that analysis. You extend that across between, she takes out her first couple voting issues to talk about me not having any like offense or anything like that. Furthermore, because she never redefines ought, all we're looking to is an obligation. So you can extend my analysis under my criterion, which tells you explicitly, because this resolution says this is what ought to do, and I define ought as an obligation, all I have to do is prove the existence of this obligation, not that it's moral or anything along those lines. In other words, all of her offense talking about me entrenching oppression and stuff like that is irrelevant in the round because I don't have to prove moral obligations, just that these obligations exist. Okay, now a big extension, jump over to the negative flow and to the top. On my Rebuttal analysis that I read, she says that my definition talks about striving. That's my argument. The Rebuttal analysis specifically talks about, in today's world, striving is the same as application because the same people who are striving are at the same time applying that knowledge. That's my argument. You extend Rebuttal, which tells you in modern society, this like striving for scientific knowledge is the same as applying that scientific knowledge. What that means is you extend my turn on the negative case, which turns her entire advocacy saying that she's now affirming because her whole advocacy is that we should constrain according to application, but not according to pursuit of knowledge. At the point where like she like mishandles the evidence and says that they're the same thing, she's affirming the resolution because she's just trying to tell you that societal good should act as a check on the application, but not on the pursuit of knowledge. So there's the first affirmative voting issue, that her whole entire case was turned with that drop. She is affirming the resolution essentially. Okay, now go to her value of innovation. I had two responses. One, I told you that's not inherently good, and two, I told you it's better achieved in the affirmative world because constraints are like a necessary thing for innovation. Both of those went dropped. You can extend those across. What this means is either you're not going to look to her value or you're going to notice that I'm winning her value. Go to her standards of preserving openness. I told you that constraints are necessary because that means necessarily that societal good acts as a check on those constraints, which is the one thing that she's trying to get in her advocacy. So again, I'm better upholding her value and her criterion regardless of which ones you decide to use, but you can go to my value of social responsibility. She tells you that they're the same as my criterion, but I gave you distinct definitions that I told you in my 1AR, and remember, it's a good thing that my criterion leads to my value. That's what they're supposed to do. So you extend my value of social responsibility and you extend Rotblat, which tells you these ethical obligations exist in interdependent societies. You can extend my criterion as well because all she says that hers precludes, but like again, I told you, because I'm winning the framework debate, like necessarily we have to use this standard because all I have to do is prove an obligation, and those are the only arguments that link. Okay, so at that point you can see that she has no offense because all of her arguments about entrenching oppression don't matter in this round at the point where all we have to do is establish an obligation. So my second voting issue is going to come off my subpoint C. She says that we could always harm, but this is dependent on her argument that there's a distinction between the application and the pursuit. So you extend Rotblat, which also tells you that he's talking about research even if you don't buy the other Rotblat analysis. So this is my second affirmative voting issue, that this creates an obligation to the rest of humanity because of all the power that scientists hold. She mishandles the resolution in my advocacy. All I have to do is prove an obligation. Therefore, she has no offense, and you're going to affirm the resolution.
Please welcome the 7th through 14th place winners in Lincoln Financial Group Lincoln Douglas debate to the stage. Congratulating today's semifinalists and finalists will be Executive Council alternate and Hall of Famer Pam McComas. In 14th place, Susan Ella from Skyview High School, Idaho, coached by Melinda Schultz. In 13th place, Erica Alexander from Michael Krupp High School, Florida, coach Ms. Mary Schick. In 12th place, Daniel Wittes from Myers Park High School, North Carolina, coach Stephen Shapaw. In 11th place, Scott Brainerd, Niskayuna High School, New York, coach Elizabeth Brainerd. In 10th place, Joshua Marson from Firestone High School, Ohio, coach Philip Marson. In 9th place, Norman Yao, Ridge High School, New Jersey, coach David Yastrzymski. In 8th place, Ty N. Tavares from Henry W. Grady High School in Georgia, coach Taylor Hatcher. In 7th place, Christian Tarzny from St. Louis Park High School, Minnesota, coached by Mr. Peter Redmond.